Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Chris Webb for joining us here too. Chris Webb is the CEO and co-founder of ChowNow. I'm the White House correspondent for France 24. In theory, we have absolutely nothing in common, but our two stories did intertwine last year, the worlds of politics in my case, and of startups and technology in Chris's case. ChowNow, if you don't know, is an online ordering and marketing platform that services almost 10,000 restaurants. We will be telling this story of how Chris had not a dispute necessarily with Apple, but maybe a little bit of a run-in, and he'll tell that story throughout our discussion here. First of all, though, Chris, could you just describe what ChowNow does, and maybe for somebody like me, tell us what the difference is to something like Grubhub?
Sure. So we started the business about 6 years ago as really an alternative for restaurants to Grubhub. So what we saw out there is local restaurants around the U.S. Really had nowhere to turn for their own tools. And so if you're a small mom-and-pop pizzeria, how are you going to compete with Domino's or Papa John's or any of the big national players who are rolling out mobile apps and seeing a lot of quick success? And so we built this white label platform that we launched 6 years ago that allows restaurants of any size in any location around the U.S. or Canada to essentially have the same tool. So it's completely white label. We take our restaurant's brands, we put them front and center, so every app that we build is branded around the restaurant's brand. We add online ordering to their website, and we do a number of other things on the marketing side as well for restaurants. And it allows them to take the orders directly from their customers and bypass any kind of middleman type marketplace like a Grubhub, who takes a fairly large cut of every single order.
Any questions that you might already have, you can send them our way. I think you already know how to do this. It's in the app. It says more on the bottom right-hand corner. Send us your questions. We will see them on screens right in front of us, and we're more than happy to take any of your questions. But back to the story of ChowNow and how things could have potentially gone wrong last year. What exactly did go wrong for you?
Yeah, so again, for the last 6 years or so, we've been building iPhone apps and Android apps for our restaurant clients, and we're now up to nearly 10,000 restaurant clients, and so we've built thousands and thousands of these apps for these small businesses around the U.S. Last July, we were submitting apps, as we often do on a weekly basis, and all of a sudden they were interjected from the App Store, which was odd. It's happened a couple times over the years. Usually it's kind of a minor thing related to some kind of other SDK, like a Google Maps SDK that changes. And so we didn't think too much of it. We got in contact with Apple, and they actually pointed us to this new guideline that they had inserted in their App Store guidelines a month prior. And it basically was one sentence. It was guideline 4.2.6 that says, going forward, we will not accept any apps that you use built using templates. And clearly, our apps, to build thousands of apps, use templates, very much like Squarespace or Wix or Weebly, use templates in order to power their websites. There's no way you can build it entirely from scratch at the cost that we offer them at. And so we got in touch with Apple, and we know them fairly well. Every one of our apps has Apple Pay embedded into it, and you can use Apple Pay. And so the Apple Pay team loves our apps because you have small merchants all over the U.S. promoting their app and telling their customers to download Apple Pay. And so that's who we reached out to immediately because it made the most sense. It's where the relationship's the tightest over there. And they said, we don't know anything about this. Let's dig into it. And it turned out that guideline was inserted because Apple has a problem with spammy apps in the App Store, and people were doing a practice called cloning, which basically, if you're a small developer, you don't have a large marketing budget, the theory is you take your one app, you clone it 1,000 times over, you tweak the name a little bit, you change some colors, and the odds of one of those 1,000 being discovered and going viral is obviously higher than one getting discovered and going viral. And so it's a practice. It's not a good practice, and Apple is trying to cut down on that, and in my opinion, they should. However, there are a lot of great benefits for using templates. So in our case, restaurants use templates, churches use templates, universities, nonprofits. I mean, the list of kind of good actors all over the world that use some type of template-based app, it's widespread. And so we went back and forth with them, and it was fairly clear we weren't going to make any movement. Once a large company's made a decision, it's really hard to get them to change. And so despite our relationship, despite actually teams inside Apple asking and kind of lobbying on our behalf, we weren't able to get anywhere. And so that lasted about a month or two. It's come July to mid-August of last year.
So you end up bypassing Apple because you don't really get anywhere with them, and you end up on Capitol Hill a few too many times. I'm sure that when you started the company, you weren't expecting to be on Capitol Hill and employing lobbyists essentially on your behalf. So how did you get to that spot where you go to a lobbying firm and you say, we need you guys to get our point across up on Capitol Hill?
Sure. So having no experience with anything to do with frankly, DC and Congress and lobbyists, just a world I don't live in, as you kind of alluded to earlier, just very different worlds. We're based in Los Angeles, and I couldn't remember the last time I was in DC for anything.
Nice place.
I've spent a lot of time there. It is nice. And so I kind of talked to our attorney and said, "There's anything here? It seems, there's a kind of slight antitrust kind of feel to it, anti-competition. Is there anything here?" And said it's kind of borderline. But who you should talk to is this firm in DC who has a lot of experience working with younger companies and large companies. And it turned out that they also represent the National Restaurant Association. They represent a number of companies in LA who I know some of the people there, SpaceX, Tesla, a number of other companies. And then some of our investors also knew them. So it was kind of out of the blue, all of a sudden we have all these connections to this one firm in DC and said, okay, without shopping and looking for a lobby group, because I don't really know what to look for, we trust them. It's these back channel references are great, and we ended up hiring them. And they basically took us on a roadshow around Capitol Hill. And I made multiple trips last fall, meeting with members of Congress and really bringing the story and highlighting it. I can go on with the story.
Is that what made the difference then? You got in touch with the right members of Congress, either on the subject matter or the ones that represent where the company is based, and were they the ones who were able to, well, essentially convince Apple to change their guidelines, because this story does have a happy ending. Apple did change its guidelines in the end, and you were okay. Who made that difference?
Yeah, so when you hire a firm, a lobbyist, they, if they're any good, they should know exactly what various members of Congress are passionate about. What are the issues that they care about? It's very convenient for us that both sides of the aisle care about small business. It happens to be a talking point that they love to talk about, but whether a Democrat, Republican. And so we actually got a lot of interest from both sides of the aisle, which is probably rare for most issues, but this one was slightly unique. And so I met with various committees, commerce committees on the Senate side, and then met with local congressmen from Los Angeles, where we're based. And there was a lot of interest, but the trick was trying to get someone to jump. So if you're ever raising capital, it's always you're trying to get the investors that are interested, who's going to jump first and submit the term sheet. Found it was very similar to this, is everyone's like, well, what's Congressman Ted Lieu going to do? I know he's interested. Is he going to do anything? What's Maxine Waters going to do? And so you need somebody to jump, and when someone jumps, then all of a sudden there's this kind of rush to kind of take credit. And so after a number of these conversations over kind of multiple days, Congressman Ted Lieu, who represents our district in LA, spoke up, and he wrote a public letter to Tim Cook at Apple, and he said, I'm very concerned about the impact that this guideline is going to have. And when he did that, other people now, members of Congress, both on the Senate side and the House side, stepped up, and not all of them wrote letters. Actually, no one else wrote a letter, but they started making calls. And Apple has a government relations team based in DC, and they started, I wouldn't say they were flooded with calls, but they started receiving calls. And then the press picked up on it. And then Recode, a journalist for Recode who covers DC and kind of the intersection of tech, wrote a piece on it about what's going on. And then TechCrunch picked it up, and then the Washington Post picked it up. And the way it was positioned, which was accurate in my opinion, is that Apple is going to damage small business and all these other kind of small players out there. And the public pressure from that actually got Apple to reconsider and eventually last December change their guidelines. So it took about 4 or 5 months of work.
So let me ask you this before we go to a whole host of audience questions we have in front of us here on the screen. Can something like this happen again, that Apple changes its guidelines or Apple changes something else that puts your business in all sorts of trouble for seemingly no reason at all? And if something like that was to happen, what should maybe those people in the audience and everybody else who owns a startup, owns a small company, maybe even a bigger company, at what point should they get interested and active? At what point should they find out who to talk to on Capitol Hill? Should they be contacting a lobbying company out of the blue before they even have any trouble? Who should they get in touch with, and how serious should they take the possibility of something like this happening?
Yeah, I would imagine most people here that have some tech, some company, they're built on top of another platform, whether it's iOS, whether it's any of these kind of other massive platforms that are owned and operated by the very large tech companies out there. And like us, we're built on top of a number of different platforms. So we have apps for iOS, for Android. We, like a lot of other people, rely on Google and Google traffic. And so I think this experience, and I don't think Apple was actually being malicious at all. They didn't set out to harm small business. There's no doubt in my mind about that. It just happened to be a side effect and consequence of this decision that they weren't even thinking about it. When you're that massive, you make changes and you don't think about it. And so something else will happen, and it could be with another platform, and it could be just like this where it's not malicious, or it could be other platforms that are intentionally trying to hurt other companies. There's kind of this gone on for years, but the Google versus Yelp kind of battle, and Jeremy, the CEO of Yelp, has been very vocal. He's testified in front of Congress. He's kind of been all over the map, talking about the cause and how Google has been damaging Yelp traffic for years and years and years. And not to get into that, but so there's both sides. There's intentional and there's just kind of this not intentional aspect. And so I think that everyone that has built on top of another platform should be prepared. And most of us are fairly small. Our company, we're about 150 people. Decent size, but still tiny, a speck compared to someone like Apple. You should be prepared, and in doing so, you should start to kind of think about who are you going to call when something like this happens, and how are you going to get help? Because just calling the platform probably won't get you very far, given kind of scale and the leverage that they have over a lot of the small players out there.
Let's take a look at some questions we have in front of us here on our screen. The one that we see at the top is the one that's been liked the most. The reason why it's there, I think, is because you mentioned that your company, ChowNow, was in the news in the end, and of course, anybody who's involved with the company will have noticed this, hence why this question comes up. This is from Natalie Leroy, how did you explain the course your company took to your clients?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things, right? So there's our client base, which at the time was called 8,000 restaurants back then, a year ago. And so how do you explain to them? They all have apps. They all had apps in the App Store. They've all been telling their customers for many, many years, download the apps, and their customers had followed, and those apps, kind of in the last year, were probably processed about $100 million in proceeds for these small businesses. So how do you take this piece of their kind of livelihood at this point and say that's going to go away at some point? Apple never gave us a deadline on when those apps were going to disappear from the App Store. This was only concerning new apps. However, they did indicate that at some point they were going to go and start kind of flushing the App Store and start removing these. But again, it was always a little fuzzy on the date. So we never actually went out to our clients because it didn't get to that point of their apps being removed. For new clients, as we have, as we have a sales team, and a sales team's out having conversations with prospects, and you have a bachelor caught in the middle that had just signed up for the service, and the service includes a whole host of things. Apps are a component of everything we do. But a lot of people are excited about having their own iPhone app and explaining to them that, sorry, this is out of our hands. We're going to do our best to get you an app. It was a difficult conversation. We refunded a lot of people if all they wanted it. In some cases, we discounted. If they signed up for the platform and they were happy with everything else we provided, including an Android app and a lot of other things, we discounted for a period of time. But it's always helpful to kind of default to just being honest and transparent. And that's kind of what we did. And it helped that the press was out there and we could point and say, we're fighting for small business. This is kind of overall what we started the business to do, not really lobby, but help small business in general. And I think it reflected well on us. I think they saw that we're the only company to put our neck out. Even though there are a lot of companies like us that were impacted, no one was willing to go up against Apple. And I think it actually helped us in the long run. It's not what we intended to. It's not the kind of good PR you want. But
as members of the press, we of course love ourselves a David versus Goliath story, and we got it with you. Let's go to another question here. While you were not necessarily in a legal gray area, I think you might have been in a gray area when it comes to the Apple guidelines that you didn't really know about. But here's a question that goes a little bit further maybe. If a new company is concerned that they're operating in a legal gray area, what is the best way to proceed?
That's tough.
You probably don't want to be there, do you?
No, I don't think you want to be in a gray area. For us,
get out quick.
Yeah. Get clarity. The further along you go and you're kind of in this kind of shaky ground, I just recommend trying to get some clarity around the gray area and then proceed from there.
Maybe there is a comparison. I don't know. Maybe you know whether this comparison is is appropriate. Maybe DraftKings is an example of that, of there being a legal gray area and having to basically find out whether they are doing something legally or not when it comes to betting. But I don't know the exact details of it, but maybe that is an example to look at that might be similar to what this question was inferring.
I mean, there's you can argue Uber and Lyft have kind of operated for many years in gray areas, and you know, even this past Monday in California, the Supreme Court of California kind of passed a law that or ruled on something that is going to have a potentially massive impact on 1099 contractors, which are basically all Uber and Lyft drivers. That's a gray area. I don't know. That's a whole other topic that I don't know much about.
Let's take another question here. I think it goes back to the actual title of our talk, when government and technology somehow can actually work together, when Congress actually works for you. Hence where this question comes from. Is this really, your case, is this really an instance of government working or lobbying working?
Well, it's both, right? I mean, no doubt we had to take our case and you know, take it to members of Congress, and we didn't have time on our side. I mean, we had to kind of, you know, there's the risk that our current restaurants were going to lose apps at some point, and so we were trying to move quickly, and so we could have reached out without hiring a firm. It would have been a whole lot harder. I mean, it's very much like why people hire investment banks and investment bankers to bring around deals and transactions. You can do it on your own, but it's very helpful when you have the experience and the network of somebody. And so I think it's a little bit of both. I tend to think that it's government working. There is a tremendous amount of small businesses. And again, for us, it's restaurants, but there's so many use cases out around the country of various small entities. Again, the timing around this was hurricane season when Houston and Florida got hit, and the Red Cross, their apps are using templates. They were raising a tremendous amount of money at that time period. Had they not had an app, yes, there are other channels to raise money, but their app was a big component of their fundraising efforts last year, and that was using templates. And so I think this was government looking out for the smaller players out there and saying, yeah, this isn't fair, and we need to do something about it.
This might be our last question, depending on our time. How much did it cost, and how much does it cost for a company to get involved in lobbying, to have, I believe in your case, 3 people pretty much dedicated to your cause for a few months up on Capitol Hill? Sounds like a pretty big expense.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we didn't shop it. I didn't know even who to call. This happened that we were introduced to one. So I know what we paid. We paid $15,000 a month as a retainer for this, and that's kind of consistently what we paid.
You did, and you still do?
We still have them on a retainer. We'll probably wind it down. Things are kind of settled out at this point, but we just wanted to make sure that everything was in good place, and we were able to kind of get up and running again with apps. So 15 grand is what we paid. I don't know if that's good or not good. I imagine if you're a much larger company with bigger lobbying efforts, your bill is going to be much more than what we paid.
The price might have just gone up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us here today. Chris Webb, the CEO and co-founder of ChowNow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.